What's up guys, and thank you for stopping by the channel. Today's project is this hyper tough lawnmower from Mega Mart, and the problem is that it was ran without oil and it locked up. We're rebuilding the engine as cheaply as possible by some unconventional means, and today we're going to finish it. This is the second part of the rebuild. However, this is actually the third video I've made on this mower. In the first video, we discovered it was ran without oil and even took the head off to see the cylinder scoring. In the next video, we dismantled the engine only to see the worst of the damage. So if you want to see either of these other two videos, the links will be in the description. For those who haven't seen the previous videos, this is where we stand. After taking the engine off the deck and removing the sump, we rotated the engine and watched how the rod and the crank moved with almost zero play. And that's a pretty good sign that we won't have any rod knock due to too much play at the big end of the rod because it was ran without oil. However, there is a good chance there was aluminum deposited on the journal from the rod, giving us zero clearance for any oil to lubricate the bearing surface. And after taking the rod cap off and wiping any extra oil off, we can see there was quite a bit of gouging. That also meant that the gouging would also be on the journal as well. We'd have to remove any extra metal that shouldn't be there and smooth it out with some fine grit sandpaper. And after fitting the rod and the piston back onto the crank, the assembly moved freely just like it was supposed to with zero binding. Now that we're all caught up, let's get this engine back together. I put the piston in the engine without using a ring compressor. I just used my fingers to squeeze each ring as it met the bore. But if you wanted to use one, most auto parts stores offer a spring compressor as a free loaner tool. Now carefully insert the crankshaft into the block and reinstall the connecting rod to the journal. Make sure that the journal is oiled to prevent a dry startup. The rod cap only goes on one way, so if you do put it on wrong, you'll definitely know about it. After reconnecting the rod to the crankshaft, rotate the engine to make sure that it spins smoothly and without any binding. Next, let's replace the lifters in the engine, which we took out earlier when we removed the camshaft. When installing the camshaft, be aware of the notch in the plastic cam gear. It's supposed to line up with an arrow on the timing gear on the crankshaft. And here's what it should look like when it's installed. If these marks aren't lined up properly, there's a good chance that the engine will not start. Once the cam gear and timing gear are lined up, carefully reinstall the oil slinger, making sure it's pushing against the governor arm. After the oil slinger is properly lined up, carefully replace the engine sump. It is extremely critical when you make the sump to the block that the oil slinger stays in proper alignment. And if the oil slinger is out of alignment, you'll risk having starting issues or even running without a governor. Now it's finally time to replace the bolts for the sump. It's a really good idea to follow up with a ratchet just to make sure that all the bolts are equally tight. Now we get to the only part that I had to purchase. Even though the engine was ran for only minutes before it locked up, the head gasket still broke when I took the head off. Luckily, the head gasket was only $8 online, so it still makes this a really cheap rebuild. Now carefully replace the head assembly and the new head gasket back on the block. One of the best parts about this model of engine is that it only requires 4 head bolts. I'm pretty sure this must have saved a lot of time and money during the manufacturing process. Now moving to the top of the engine, replace the flywheel and make sure it's lined up so you can insert the key. And finally follow that up with the starter cup, its washer, and of course the large nut. Now we have to remove the valve cover so we can replace the push rods, but this is when things almost went wrong. After moving the rocker arms to install the push rods, I discovered that the exhaust valve tappet was there, but the intake valve tappet had disappeared. We'll need to replace it to use the mower in the future, but I can adjust the valve lash so we can at least get the motor running and hear if we have any rod knock. I'm going to have to apologize here as I will not be showing the valve lash adjustment due to mainly time constraints. We can now finally replace the valve cover and the 3 bolts that hold it to the engine. And while you're here, you might as well replace the spark plug wire back onto the spark plug. The next thing to do is to replace the governor linkage to the carburetor. To do this, I'll have to remove the carburetor. The only thing holding the carb to the intake tube is the air filter assembly. And after taking the air filter assembly off, we can now pull the carburetor off of the intake tube. Be very careful as the O-ring on the back of the carburetor might slide off. If it does, simply put the O-ring back on the back side of the carburetor. And with the carburetor finally loose, we can now reinstall the linkage to the carburetor and then to the governor arm on the back of the engine. And once that's done, simply slide the carburetor back onto the intake tube and replace the air filter assembly. It's finally time to put the engine back onto the deck. I'm used to seeing the underside of mowing decks covered in inches of grass clippings, so to see this one looking this clean is really strange. And before we go any further, I'm going to put some oil into the engine. That way we don't have a repeat of the same problem. And here's something you should practice every time. Always check the oil level before you mow each and every time. Next, what we'll do is reconnect the brake cable, and then we'll follow that up by installing the fuel tank. It simply slips into the top cover. Now reconnect the fuel line to the carburetor and replace the recoil assembly on top of the engine. And finally, add some fresh 100% gas to the fuel tank, prime the carburetor, and let's try starting this engine, and hopefully it starts. And when I try and start this engine for the first time, I'm going to do very little editing. That way you can see what really happened. Unfortunately, it did not start, But then again, I'm not sure when this engine ran last with gas in the tank. And what I'm going to do now is manually prime the engine with starting fluid. Hopefully the engine will run long enough so we can hear how it sounds. Well, it still didn't start, so now I'm really confused as to what the problem is. I'm not going to give up though. I'm going to give it a few more tries and then I'll start diagnosing the problem. Well, it finally started, but it died after 5 seconds of running, which would point to a carburetor problem. This time I'm going to excessively prime the carburetor and see if it runs longer than 5 seconds. Then I'll be very confident that it really is a carburetor issue. Well, it ran longer this time than the first time, so I'm pretty sure the carburetor just needs to be cleaned. But it did start and it ran just fine. And I will let you know that after I finished filming, I did try to start the mower once again, and to my surprise, it ran without dying. I'm guessing the fresh gas that went through the carburetor loosened up whatever was clogging the carburetor. Well, it looks like the cheap rebuild of this cheap mower was very successful. There was 0 rod knock. The only thing now is to replace the missing valve tappet, and we should be ready to mow. So the big question now is, what should I do with this mower? Should I give it away to somebody that needs a mower, or should I keep it and give you updates as I use it? Or is there something else that you want me to do with it? I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate your time. Please feel free to ask any questions, and I hope to see you in my next video.